I'm Lamondre Pugh, CEO of Billion Strong, a global nonprofit organization for and by people with disabilities. Now, there are a lot of organizations around the world doing amazing things on behalf of the 1.3 billion people who identify as having a visible or invisible disability. But what we haven't seen, at least until now, is an internal movement. A global community of people with disabilities that have come together and that says, this is who we are, these are our issues, and we matter. And that's what we envision for Billion Strong. It's really a declaration of who we are and what we can do. It is also a way of recognizing and honoring all of the intersectionalities that are represented in our beautiful community. Now, this can get complicated sometimes because society in general sees disability as a deficit or weakness, and that can't be further from the truth. I have a disability. I'm not broken, I'm not weak. My mobility may be different, but I can do anything that I want to do. For example, I'm not interested in climbing mountains. Now you may be, and that's fine, but I'm not. But I am interested in moving mountains, and that's exactly what we plan to do. What we have to remember is identity is a two-way street. It's not only about the way that the world sees you, but it's also about how you see yourself. Having an organization like Billion Strong that focuses on identity is critical so that we can share and talk about our lived experiences with disabilities and let people know what's happening around the world. And sometimes you don't even know what's possible for you until you see someone in a similar situation doing it. And that's what this movement is all about. We are moving the needle on perception, other people's perception, and our own. The goal of Billion Strong is to help people find their own empowerment and move forward. And we want to make it sustainable. And we can do this by creating a loop of identity, education, professional development, and economic empowerment. And here's the thing. We can have all the kumbaya moments we want. And I love kumbaya moments. I have them all the time. But until we can start to see real economic empowerment, until we start to see real financial changes for people with disabilities all around the world, then we're just having kumbaya moments. I'm passionate about moving us forward as a community and as a world. And we seek to unite, to educate, and to elevate. And this is an invitation to you to roll up your sleeves, come along with us on this journey, and work with us and move this forward. What we're doing is huge, and we need your help with raising funds for Phase 1 and Phase 2 of Billion Strong, and to set the groundwork for connecting people with disabilities all around the world. When we come together as a global community, then we will truly begin to see things change in our favor. We're stronger together. Billion Strong. Make your contribution today.
Welcome, everyone. I am David Perez, Special Advisor for Billion Strong and Chief Financial Officer for Rue Global Impact. I'm happy to be here as your host for the Americas region. I am from Costa Rica and have been working in the disability inclusion space for the past 5 years. Today is December 3rd, which is the International Day of Persons with Disabilities, and we decided to make this the official launch of the Billion Strong's crowdfunding campaign. Billion Strong is a global disability identity movement that aims to empower our community. To learn more about it, visit the website at www.billion-strong.org and celebrate our launch. We are conducting 6 webinars to give you a glimpse about the situation of the community of people with disabilities in the different parts of the world. For this session, for the Americas session, we have an amazing guest, Ileana Rodriguez, who is the principal at iDesign Access and is an international architectural design consultant for major infrastructure projects, focusing on inclusive design. She is currently a board member of the Americas Paralympic Committee, athlete representative for the region. She knows the Americas through personal experience because her work takes her to almost every country in the continent. Welcome, Ileana.
Hi, Dave. It's always great to see you and also be having this conversation in such an important day for people with disabilities. And thank you for you and your team for inviting me to be the person that is going to be talking on this topic on this region when you guys have such a great pool of people that you can call. So I'm very honored to be here with you.
You're one of our favorites. We love the work you do, and we love everything that has to do with your work and the impact that you're having with in the disability community across the Americas. So thank you for joining us. So to get us started, the community of people with disabilities in the Americas is very diverse. Like the situation of persons with disabilities in Central America is completely different from the situation of people with disabilities in North America, in Canada, in the USA. That means that there are good and bad things that happen in both ends of the spectrum. But I really wanted to ask you, from your experience traveling through to all these countries and knowing in the ground, being a person with a disability yourself and seeing the things that happen, what do you think is an area that we have made some progress, like as a whole continent, in terms of disability inclusion, of course?
I think it's a very interesting question, Dave. And I believe that today, just by the fact that we are having this conversation and it's going to be heard in a region is already a big step. This is not something that was happening when I was competing as a Paralympian um, in 2012. This conversation was not even on the table in many places yet. So this is definitely something that is similar throughout the continent, but here in Canada, obviously, and in the US, is a conversation that it's much older than in the rest of the continent. But there's a lot of work that still needs to be done. And I think that is a constant process. And now we see a ripple effect going down into the rest of the continent now, and more people are getting involved. And we're seeing this as something that needs to change. And I think that the most important thing is that we are having the conversation, and people with disabilities need to start feeling empowered by this type of conversations, and changes should start happening after this.
Absolutely. So I wanted to start in a positive note because most of this conversation, the disability inclusion conversation, is not positive really. Because when we look at the numbers and we look at the data, we realize that things are bad, really. Honestly, they're simply bad. That there's a strong link especially in developing countries between poverty and disability. There seems to be no way out of poverty when you are a person with a disability or have a person with a disability in your family. And poverty creates an ecosystem in Latin America where progress and development of the human being become very difficult. What is a problem that you have seen across the continent that's common, that is something that has created that sort of space where progress is so difficult in disability inclusion?
I think that you pointed out first when you said that it's looked at it in a negative way. People with disabilities, having a disability has a negative connotation. And numbers are important. I think that the numbers show that negative side of it, that we must do something to fix it because look at these numbers. But fixing it should come from the opportunity side, not so much from this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong, because that's not going to get us anywhere. We already know, numbers show, policies show that something is wrong and it's not working. And we need to make a change. But to make a change, you have to look at the positive things. What can a person with a disability bring to the table? What can a person with a disability do? And one of the biggest problems for people with disabilities to have a voice, I think there's two problems to this. One of them is government, because we find a lot of laws and regulations that are there, but they're not implemented in many countries in Latin America. In the United States and Canada, it's a different case because of the way that the legal system works and how it was created is a bit different than it is in the rest of Latin America. But there is even countries in Latin America that the law don't even exist. So governments need to work a little more to provide these rights for people with disabilities. But at the same time, we find within the government the fact that people with disabilities become almost completely reliant on the governments to be able to have a payment or to be able to have an income that is usually very tiny that comes every month. And there you see the poverty. And what happens with that is that people get used to receiving this money and don't see beyond that the fact that they can do better than that, that they can request and they can be citizens that have the rights to do better. And they stop doing what they need to do to get these rights to them. And it's an uncomfortable situation for both. But at the same time, I think that there should be more on the private sector doing for this to change. And for that, the government cannot just stop requesting people with disabilities to do something. I think that all of us as a society should be doing something. People with disabilities and people without a disability, business owners should be part of the conversation and find the opportunities and the positive side of this conversation, something that is not happening. It's not happening yet. It's happening in very tiny places and very few people are having, even I would take the risk to say that even from the people with disability community, the conversation is not always positive. It can come a lot of time from complaining. And who wants to be listening to complaints? We want to find solutions.
Right.
If the problem we already know is there. So I think that we have to start turning this around a little bit.
But it's such a complex thing, right? Because it's not just governments, it's not just corporations, it's not just you and me as people. Everyone together can actually make change happen, but one piece working alone is what we have seen for a while. Like, progress is not made by one single individual. It needs to be everyone pulling together towards the same direction. And disability inclusion, sadly, has not seen like that support or that globalization of the support towards the same goal, which would be inclusion. But what does inclusion mean? What is it? How does it look in real terms?
I think it's because we haven't embraced the fact that all of us at some point could encounter ourselves in a situation of a disability. And it has such a negative connotation. If you have a disability, you are already seen by somebody that is different, that you're marked by society as somebody that, would have bigger challenges within your family, within your friend's family. Oh, poor thing, she has a disability, she's struggling now. Guess what? Yes, but people with disability have the time. Once they accept their disabilities, once they realize that what their challenges are and they recognize what they can do, they just keep on having a life, because the disability shouldn't define who the person is or what the person is capable of doing with whatever is given. So I think as a society, we are constantly looking for that perfection that at the end of the day, by the way, doesn't exist. Sorry to bring it up to you. So disabilities, it belongs to that world of things are not perfect. So I think that we have people with disabilities have to embrace the fact that none of us are, some of us use a disability, some of them don't have a disability, but they do some things that that makes them even more having a more complex reality than people with disabilities. So it is a matter of us accepting each other and understanding the fact that we don't need to be equal to be doing well.
Hmm.
And at some point in our lives, even in our days, we're going to find ourselves with some kind of a disability. And this is something that I always try to bring to students that I teach in universities, that I put them the very simple example of them. What would you do if you had a lot of money and you can go to, most likely you're going to buy all of what you want. That means that you will end up with 10 bags if you're really like looking to buy things. So that means that you would have 5 bags on each hand, and most likely you're going to be armless. So for that short period of time between your car or your transit system and your mall, you're going to end up with some kind of impairment that is not going to allow you to do the things that you're used to do. If you have to open a door, if you have to sit down with a bunch of bags, you're going to have balance issues most likely. And so these are similar things that a person with a disability will experience, that if we were to provide environments that would support this, the day that you go to the mall and you buy all that stuff, you will be completely able to be comfortable and enjoy your life. And at the same time, we're providing for everyone.
Yeah.
So there's small things that you can do to include everyone. And we think that is such a hard thing to do, but it is not. If all of us do our part, for sure.
So there are two crucial things in what you said. One, that everyone can acquire disabilities at some point in their lives. And that's something that Lamondre Pugh, the CEO of Billion Strong, always says. And what he says specifically is that disability is the only minority group that we can all be a part of at any point of our lives. And as such, it should be the better served group instead of the worst served, which it is. But also, the other point that I wanted to take from what you were saying just now is that disability has a bad connotation. And that has been true forever, like for years and years. Since society has existed, disability has been seen as something that's wrong, that's bad, that sometimes even as a curse to a family, that they ended up with a child with a disability because they were bad parents or bad people. But we tried to correct that with the CRPD. We changed the definition of disability. That's one of the first articles. We changed it from a medical definition to a social definition. Like, disability has to do with the barriers that society puts in place. But that, even though we said it and we keep saying it, it has not translated into reality. The cultural awareness about what disability really is not there. People don't understand that disability can be situational, that it can be permanent, but it doesn't deter from your human beingness.
Yes, definitely. And it doesn't deter you from you being a person that lives with dignity. I think which is a basic human right. And yes, and I agree with you, but I also think that part of the problem is that these things don't happen. This change, if we think about it quite recently, this definition. And these are things that, especially in a culture like Latin America, as you well said it, that is a negative connotation where you have somebody in your family that has a disability and people want to hide that negative thing because you want your family to be doing well. And we need to change that conversation of like, listen, yes, I have somebody with a disability, but she has all these other qualities and these great things that are way more important whether she has a disability or doesn't have a disability. And I think that's where the conversation needs to start changing, but that doesn't change just by having conversations like this one. It needs to go deeper. It needs to go to schools. It needs to go to universities. It needs to go to employers. It needs to go to all the different levels in our society to really understand and to really go back. I always say that it's very important to go to the church, and even because it's such an important part of the culture that also in the church it has a negative connotation, and it shouldn't. You're just a person that goes to church. Anybody else goes to church. And when these things start to appear like that, I think that's when we're going to start seeing great changes. And for that, you need schools that are accessible, you need churches that are accessible, government buildings that are accessible. And at the same time, you need to have the society that is more open to this and have this conversation really happen. And because people with disabilities are getting out, you cannot tell somebody with a disability to get out of their house if they have a wheelchair, for example, and they're going to find a street that is not going to allow them to be independent. Most likely the person won't do it because it won't feel safe. But I think it's also the responsibility of a person with a disability to be uncomfortable and get out there regardless, because it needs to be seen. The problem needs to be seen. Otherwise, it's not going to be resolved.
And that's very important because whenever you talk to people that don't have to do with the disability space, and you mention disability and everything that we're working on and the things that we're trying to do to solve the issues that the community faces, they don't seem to realize that people with disabilities exist around them, that they have people with disabilities even in their own families. Like, they don't see disability, and that's not because it's a good thing, right? Like, they don't see disability because they see the person. They completely make them invisible. They don't think that people with disabilities exist out in society. And actually, when I've had this conversation, they tend to think that we fixed things, that everything is okay now because we have accessible bathrooms, because we have ramps in malls and airports. Like, why are we still talking about this? And when they see the numbers, they immediately go to the other end of the spectrum. They say, okay, we need to do something. But they never take action internally, like changing the way they think in terms of inclusion and people with disabilities, to realize that's part of the problem, because disability has been around forever. And if we all did something about it, it would have been fixed decades, if not hundreds of years ago.
I think it's a very naive way of looking at it, because if we look at our world, we're getting older. We're not getting any younger. Our population is growing older and older, and people now, they last much longer in a situation where most likely they're going to need something that would support them and will help them because they need the accessibility. And why would you not have a meaningful life after you're retired just because you don't have places that allow you to do things? What a miserable life is that? So I think that we need to start thinking that hopefully all of us are going to make it to a very old age, and also that we want to enjoy it when we're there. And we have in our hand the possibility of giving people that opportunity right now if we keep on moving towards that direction. So I think it's very naive of a young person today to think that a disability is such a foreign concept or something that is not going to happen. Or I always think of this story when I was in college, that I was taken to the Virgin Islands to see if the Virgin Islands were accessible. So that was quite an interesting trip. The
Yeah.
perks of having a disability. So I ended up in the Virgin Islands, and we were talking with somebody quite high in the government that was invited to give the closing remarks. And I was very surprised because in the closing remarks, this guy was denying the fact that people in the Virgin Islands needed accessibility because it was more for tourists, not so much for the locals, because people in the Virgin Islands were very athletic and they were very much into sports, and people who do sports don't acquire disabilities. They're very active people. So I'm thinking there, and I remember me being super young. And after this very important guy, which I cannot remember exactly his role, after I finished, I couldn't hold it. I grabbed the microphone and I told the guy, listen, I was born in an island. I was very athletic. I was very young, and I ended up in a wheelchair. This can happen to anybody. What are you talking about? Basically, I confronted this guy. And it was funny because the following day I was all over the newspapers and I didn't know. And it was interesting because people without a disability think that this could never happen to them. And You know what? It can happen to anybody, regardless of your level of athleticism. Actually, if you are very athletic, most likely you're taking high risks more probably. So you might find that even more common. And I think it's just a matter of accepting the fact that anything can happen to us. We're not that as powerful as we think in terms of that.
Yeah, and I think that bias is especially true in our region because for some reason there is not much contact with people with disabilities. And we know the reason, right? Exclusion is the reason. Because since people with disabilities are excluded from schools, you don't see them at school. Then you don't see them at work. Then you don't see them at church because there's no way for them to access church. And you simply end up not seeing. That's what I was talking about when I said that they were completely invisible to society. And that's because society has made it. But people with disabilities, you were saying, need to take charge of this conversation. Like they need to go out there and show themselves. How would you like encourage someone with a disability that hasn't had many opportunities to just start taking them? What would you say to them?
I think the first thing, if I was in any country in Latin America and even in the US, I would grab the law and understand what my rights are today in my country. And if I don't have the same rights as somebody without a disability, the first thing I would do is fight for that in terms of being recognized
Mhm.
before our society as anybody else. And if you already have that done, understand where that language is and get out of your house. Be uncomfortable. I think we all need to be uncomfortable to make changes. And get out of your house. Go to the first school that you want to go to. Take your child to your school, to the school that you want your child to go to, and grab that piece of paper that says what your rights are, and show up yourself out there. And if nothing changes, keep on finding more people in your same situation. I'm pretty sure you're gonna find more than what you think, and take them with you. And you're gonna see people start realizing that we need to do something about it. And I think this is the first thing. You have to take ownership of it and understand what your responsibilities are
Yeah.
and what solutions you can bring to the table as well. Because there has to be flexibility from both sides. It doesn't have to be just the other side doing everything that you want. I think
Mm.
you have to, it's an educational process, and it doesn't happen in 2 days. It has taken a long time. And this is a good time. This is a good time because you're seeing companies, bigger companies that are recognizing it, global companies that understand the needs of this. And as we become more of a globalized world, I think this is something that we can take advantage of.
Yeah. And now that you mentioned companies, why do you think that companies are now starting to look at disability? Because again, disability has been around forever. But why is it that today, like right now, they're starting to look at disability inclusion as something that can actually be a differentiator for them?
You said it. It's not a hidden thing. Companies that are not meant to be charities, they're meant to be in a good way, I think. They're meant to be sources of income for everybody. And they see the numbers. They see the numbers, and the numbers are out there. So you have such a great number of people, because it's not just the people with disability. A disability affects the person that has it, but together with that affects at least 3 people around one person. So if you do the math, I'm sorry to bring it up to you, but you have pretty much, I want to say 60% of the world, if not more, that is affected by a disability. So are you leaving all of those people that could be involved, that could be making profit? Are you going to keep them out of the equation? I wouldn't if I was a business person. I mean,
Yeah. And it has taken too long for them to realize that. Because when we look at the numbers that you're mentioning, it's 15% of the world's population, right? Those are the estimates, quote unquote estimates, because they are based on studies that the World Bank released in 2011. So that's outdated data. We know for a fact that in the United States, it's even higher than that. It's 1 in 4 Americans that have a disability, and that's 25% there. That's 25% of the population of the United States that has a disability. But when you include allies, accomplices, and champions of disability, that's when it becomes immeasurable. And also, and this is very important, we have numbers on the disposable income that the community of people with disabilities manages or handles or influence, and it goes over the trillions and trillions of dollars. And that's not including economic empowerment that could happen if inclusion was actually something that was real. So if people with disabilities get jobs, what's going to happen? They're going to spend more money, and that's going to make more dynamic economies, and it's going to benefit everyone. There's data from the OECD that says that countries are leaving 7% of their GDP behind just because they are not actively including the community of people with disabilities.
It doesn't surprise me. Those numbers, I don't have them as well managed as you do. But it definitely doesn't surprise me, Dave. And I think the fact these companies are realizing the great opportunity that is found there. And I think it's great to see that. It's the biggest community that it's completely forgotten in a way. And it's been forgotten for too long. And we definitely have to change that. And I think it's changing slowly. And I think part of the work that I do, it makes me very happy because when I work for the Paralympic Games or I work for the Pan American Games in terms of overseeing the accessibility of the games, you see how the mind of the people changes with time. The process of my work doesn't start on the day of the games, doesn't start in the year of the game. Usually starts 3 years out of the games, 4 years out of the games. And you see the first conversation, everybody's just, we want to be very inclusive, we are good people, we're going to make it happen. The second conversation is about, but what are you going to do? When they realize the things that they need to do and what it takes, then that barrier of, oh, we're doing a little bit, that should be enough. No, it's not enough. And then you start to have the conversation, why is it not enough? And you start to educate people. By the time that the games leave, not only they leave infrastructures that are accessible, they're not always perfect, but they're much better than they were before most of the time. And the most important thing is that they leave professionals that are going to go to other industries who have learned about this topic in the process. And for me, it's been quite interesting. I lived it in Lima, going from the people at the airport in Lima. The first time I arrived in Lima, being completely independent, were in shock. They wanted me to go. They wanted to take my suitcase. They were very worried because my suitcase ran away from me and I have ways to manage that with my chair and stuff. And the guys, oh my goodness, lady, but let me help you. I'm like, just leave me alone. Let me do my thing. It's not, I would tell you if I need it, but I'm okay. And the reaction of the people at security, all of these things changed so much from the day that I arrived to Lima until the day I left Lima. To the point that I saw the athletes going through the airport, and it was a whole different experience from the experience that I had the first time I went. And this is the things that we need to start seeing, that people get educated and people start to understand. But the only way to see that happen is with kids in school, that they see a kid with a disability and it's okay to have a friend in the school, especially with kids don't care about disabilities. Which is the most beautiful thing.
Yeah.
And kids with disabilities, university of people where people with disabilities can go. And then you have industries that would have people with disabilities that work at these industries as well. And it's not going to be isolated cases. It's you do what you want to do just because you want to do it, not because the disability didn't allow you to do it.
Yeah, definitely. If inclusion starts happening, it will start happening more. Like it's like a snowball effect that will happen. And that happens whenever you start working with a company, whenever you start working with a government agency, or wherever you start introducing the topic of disability inclusion, they start realizing how much is left to do. And they start also realizing that it is something that can change lives, and work starts happening. It's very beautiful to see how change starts happening when we start pushing for change. We wish that we didn't have to push for change when it comes to disability inclusion, because it should just be like, people should be included every day, everywhere that they go. But this is where we are. We need to fight to get rights, and we need to make sure that people are empowered to fight. And that's where I want us to go to. People with disabilities are not empowered, not only to fight for their rights, but to be people with disabilities. They usually try to hide their disabilities. And that happens a lot in every region of the world. But in the Americas, I know it happens even more because of the negative connotation that disability has around it. What can we do to have people with disabilities be proud of having disabilities?
I don't know if proud is necessarily the word. I think acceptance is the word. You have to be proud of who you are. You have to be happy with who you are. And if being a person with a disability is part of who you are, be proud of who you are. And that's okay. And I think this is something, and it's not in the Americas. I think one of the places that have struck me a lot too is Asia. In Asia is quite impressive, this topic as well. And I think it has a lot of similarities of Latin America, because we have in our household this idea that we need to take care of the person that has a disability. We need to take care of our elderly. We need to take care, which is true. Okay. I'm not saying it's not true. Of course, we have to take care of our elderly. We have to, but taking care of people with disability means empowering them. Doesn't mean reducing them to be somebody that is below the person that doesn't have necessarily a disability. So I think this is the important conversation that we have to start thinking that we're equal, that we have dignity, and we have to be treated with dignity. And this is the biggest, I think is one of the biggest problems, because a lot of time I have the feeling that they treat me in a certain place as a favor, or they do something in a certain way as a favor. And I'm like, wait a second, I'm paying taxes here. You're not doing me a favor. I'm paying for your service, so you're not doing me a favor. So I think that we need to change that conversation from our household, that we're not here to do a favor to the person with a disability. We are here to live with the person with a disability.
Mhm.
And the person with a disability is here to live with somebody that doesn't have a disability. And those limits have to be understood between both sides. It's a very tough one.
Yeah.
It's a very tough one, and it's a very tough one in a society that is very much culturally. We are a society that has that mother attitude of, we need to take care of this person, we need to be, and that's great, but you have to let people be and people fly. Otherwise, they're not going to discover what they can or cannot do. And that protectionist mind comes from all the levels, huh? It goes from the house all the way to the government. So it's a big problem. It's a social problem.
It is a social problem, and we always make fun of the fact that there's a like el pobrecito mentality when talking about people with disabilities. The poor person with disability that has to deal with that life, and we have to help them as much as we can because they were dealt the bad cards in life. And that's really the wrong way of looking at disability, and that's the wrong way of looking at anything in life. No one should be seen as less for anything.
Yes.
For anything in life. Inclusion's not about that. But there are some things that are happening. We mentioned companies coming together. We haven't mentioned, but the Sustainable Development Goals include disability inclusion and accessibility in many of the goals. I think it's like 17 of them. But, and here's the key. or at least I haven't seen many people take advantage of the fact that the Sustainable Development Goals are requesting everyone to be inclusive and taking their organizations, their nonprofits and their disability persons organizations to the next level, working with agencies, working with governments to make sure that those goals are met. I haven't seen people taking advantage of that golden opportunity that the Sustainable Development Goals bring to the table.
I think it comes down to, in my view, I think it comes down to you can create as many laws, as many requirements, as many agreements as you want. But if there is not a system to implement, it's pointless. So with those goals, they're great and they're a great way to start. But how are we going as a society to implement them? That link is missing. And I think it's part of what happens in those countries that have regulations, those countries that have already things in place that respond to those goals, by the way. But there is not a system to implement them locally.
Yeah.
So how would you take care of that? For example, it might not be perfect. It might things to improve here in the US, but in the states, there are certain states that have systems that go beyond what the federal government requires in buildings to be accessible. And there's states that have even more requirements and even ways to implement it that not even the federal government has to make sure that buildings are accessible when you're providing those services. And I think it's very helpful because for once, it doesn't allow for people with disabilities. It gives them great opportunity to go almost anywhere, unless it's an older building and there's a different conversation. But newer buildings have these requirements. And if you're remodeling an old one, you have to also comply with this. So this makes great improvement along the way and allows for not only the business owner not to be in trouble with the law and be sued by somebody who has an impairment, but it allows also for people with disabilities to participate. So I think it's a win-win situation for everyone. And this is the way that it's been done here. What are we doing in countries where the law exists, but there is no system to implement it or to make sure that it's happening? Where is the building department enforcing these regulations? So I think this is the conversation that needs to start happening. Otherwise, we're not going to see great improvement, at least in the built environment, which of course affects the social aspect of it greatly.
Yeah, and that's the interesting part, right? Whenever you start talking about disability inclusion, you start seeing links everywhere. You become like a detective, finding ways that things affect other things, and that there cannot be inclusion unless you do everything. But if you try to do everything at once, then you're probably not going to be able to do everything. This question, I know it's complicated, and I really want to give you like freedom in answering this. But where do you think we should start when it comes to disability inclusion? What's the first step if we haven't done anything?
I think it's education. I believe in education, and I think it's a super powerful tool. And people have to, first of all, if you don't have money and you have education, you still have some power. If you have both, you have more power. But you can create the other one with power. You can create inclusion. And with education, you can create more wealth in a way, and well-being and many other things, because you have the opportunities. And I think the reason why I mention wealth is because it's very important for people with disabilities to feel empowered. You needed to be able to feel empowered and to be able to do things. And I think that education in terms of people with disabilities is key. And it's key because it's going to empower them to be able to go and fight for their rights. It's going to empower them to be able to, in a very educated manner, be able to ask for their rights, but also offer solutions to what they need. and in any sector. But for that education piece to happen, more conversations like this need to happen, of course. But also, we have to start knocking the door in the education system to open the door for people with disabilities. And this is not something that is out there. You don't see it everywhere.
Mhm.
Even here in the United States, you don't have programs in universities that allow people with disabilities to do sports, for example. In most of the universities, they're very selected universities where you can do that. And it's such an important part of college life in the United States. How comes you don't have adaptive sports offered to people with disabilities? So I think that everywhere, this is a very important piece. And I think it's the place where you need to start and continue. It should never stop. I
Yeah.
think.
Yeah, education is definitely key, and it again, it goes to everything with education, because education is also like a gateway for people to start relating themselves with disability and understand that there are people with disabilities around them if they see them at school. And that creates empowerment, and that empowerment also gives them the possibility to create change in the end. But
And education includes people without disabilities, by the way.
yeah,
It doesn't include, it's not just for people with disabilities. And I always say, like in my sector, I always wish that architecture schools would have this topic in every design class on how, because when I went to school, I remember everybody was looking nice and perfect in all of the models and everything that we built. Everybody was 6 foot tall, beautiful models. Everybody was perfect. And this was something that always bothered me because then there was me designing everything the opposite way.
so Ileana, now that we're getting close to the end, I really want to have some sad but difficult conversations. Because do you think that the region, the continent, the Americas is working together efficiently to solve inclusion problems? Or do you think that there's fracture in in how we're addressing the problems?
I think there is fracture because even though we are a continent full of similarities, we're also full of differences in every country. And some countries, the more developed the country is, the more I think the conversation could run into inclusion. And again, that has to do a lot with education. So I think that's why I insist so much because there is like less developed countries that, for example, they try to put all kids with disabilities in one school, for example. This is just a random example, but it's very common.
Yeah.
Where this is a huge mistake, I think, because you're isolating people with disabilities. And the reality is that we live in a society where we have all kinds of people. And both we have to understand people with disability and without disabilities that it is what it is. So I think there's a lot of fractures in place, but at the same time, I would hate to say that it's completely negative.
Mhm.
I